World Insight. The G20 Summit concludes in Bali. To understand the G20's pivotal role in bringing leaders together and building strategic trust, we speak exclusively to former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd.
What I see in the bilateral summit between President Biden and President Xi Jinping is an effort by both leaders to stabilize the relationship.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. I'm in Southeast Asia this week, providing you insights on the G20 and APEC meetings taking place in Indonesia and Thailand. The 17th G20 Summit wrapped up with a positive signal on global cooperation. On the theme of Recover Together, Recover Stronger, the meeting focused on public health, sustainability, and also digital transformation. In the context of the G20 multilateral framework, a host of bilateral meetings were launched between leaders to seek solutions to global challenges. Chinese President Xi Jinping had his first meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden since the latter took office. On the sidelines, Chinese President Xi Jinping also met with newly inaugurated Australian Prime Minister for the very first time, as well as other state leaders. These talks send a positive signal to the world. For more on the G20, I talked to Kevin Rudd, who is now the president and CEO of Asia Society. He used to serve as Australia's Prime Minister. Mr. Prime Minister, what a pleasure to see you once again. Thank you so much for your time.
It's good to be back with you and to be able to greet all of our friends in China.
Do you expect much outcome coming out of the G20 summit?
Well, we should stand back for a moment and appreciate the fact that the G20, and I'm a co-founder of the G20 when it was started at summit level in 2008-9. And I remember dealing a lot with Chinese leaders at the time and American leaders at the time about what we'd do in the global financial crisis. And we decided to create this thing at summit level. One of the advantages we thought of at the time is that in geopolitics, when things get really bad between whichever countries, the thing about the G20 is it does each year bring everyone around one table. And therefore the advantage has been on this occasion is that you've had this opportunity for President Xi Jinping and President Biden to get together, as you've had, for example, with Prime Minister Albanese and President Xi Jinping. In other words, it has its own inherent value in normalizing the discourse. And then there's a further reason. This G20, because you have the 20 largest countries in the world around one table, are also saying with a common voice to our friends in Beijing and our friends in Washington, we all want a more stable US-China relationship because it's to the benefit of the entire world. So I think having that as an opportunity where you've got all these leaders from France, from Germany, from the United Kingdom, from India, from Japan, from Korea, from Australia, and other countries, including Canada, around the table, they are all actually conveying a very clear message, which is that we want a more stable geopolitics. We don't wish away all the differences. They have to be worked their way through one by one by one. But I think the advantage of convening is that it makes it very physical. People know that the eyes of the world are on these two big countries to seek to resolve their difficulties in a manner which is both peaceful and stable.
China-U.S. Leadership met and promised to establish a mechanism on strategic consultations and communications. Now, how much do you see that would provide a stabilizing factor to the bilateral relations?
Well, Tian Wei, what I see in the bilateral summit between President Biden and President Xi Jinping is an effort by both leaders to stabilize the relationship. You know, and I know, and your viewers know, that the relationship has been deteriorating for quite a number of years now, probably the last 3 years, perhaps even the last 5 years. And as a result, it was in a state of free fall. I think what both leaders decided to do with this summit is put a floor underneath the relationship. And I think that is a good thing, to stabilize it. But as you know, and as I know, stabilization does not equal normalization. So therefore, there's still a lot of work to be done, which is why I'm also pleased to see that in the Chinese readout from the meeting, they've indicated that US Secretary of State Blinken will be traveling to Beijing early in the new year to do work in that area of strategic communication that you just referred to. And I think to construct a number of stabilization mechanisms for the longer term. But at this stage, what we've done is open the door to that possibility. Far better that the door is opened, even if not fully opened. It's far better that that's the case than the door remain slammed shut.
We see several areas being mentioned in the readouts of both sides. One is diplomacy, foreign policy, consultations and communication. The other is finance, including microeconomy and also trade and economic ties. Meanwhile, they also pledge to work together for the quote-unquote success of COP27. Now, among all of these points, Mr. Prime Minister, which one do you see might really have a good starting point?
Well, I think we should put this work into two categories. One is what I call building guardrails around the overall strategic relationship. And of course, the center question there is Taiwan. When I look, for example, at the language used by Xi Jinping in the Chinese readout, he talks about the need to take measures that help protect the relationship from crisis and conflict. He refers to guardrails such as obviously the three communiques of 72, 79, and 82 between the US and China, each of which deal with Taiwan. But he also speaks about the need for new protections in the relationship. The term he uses is fanghu. And looking at the term fanghu, it's like a protective guardrail in my analysis. And then you look at another piece of language used by Xi Jinping, which is the two sides need to also deploy what he described as an anquanwang, which is like a security safety net. So I take some encouragement from this language because it is somewhat parallel to what President Biden and what National Security Advisor Sullivan and Secretary of State Blinken have been saying in recent times about the need for managed competition, for guardrails in the relationship, in order to reduce the level of risk of crisis, conflict, and war. So at this overall strategic management level, I believe that will be hard work, difficult work, but both leaders have now commissioned that work in order to restabilize the relationship. At the second level, which you pointed to, that lies in practical areas of cooperation on macroeconomic stability across the world. It lies also in the question of trade and the trends of trade protectionism. And thirdly, of course, in climate change. Where I think that we're more likely to see early action rather than later action is in climate change. And it's very simple because Secretary Kerry is currently in Sharm el-Sheikh with Xie Zhenhua from China. And these two individuals know each other very well. They will work together now very closely. And perhaps between them, they'll be able to re-inject political momentum into COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh to produce a better outcome there than may have been the case before.
If you look at both sides, there are issues that they both touch on, yet with very different language. You have been talking about how to avoid war for the past several years already. So in that retrospect, how much do you read into the languages used by both sides? What does that mean for that eventual guardrail, the nature of it? For example, on the issue of Taiwan and others.
Well, you're right. I've been working on this for a long time. In fact, in some respects, going back to 2014. But more recently, since the election of the Biden administration, when I've been advocating the concept of managed strategic competition, the use of guardrails, and in particular, the way this can be deployed in order to ensure that we have an avoidable war. That is one where we don't resort to armed force. Guardrails, for them to be effective, have to be applied to areas where each side believes they've got strategic red lines. Now, in the case of China and the United States, they both have their own strategic red lines over Taiwan. President Xi Jinping made clear his view of, to quote him, the insurmountable strategic red line of Taiwan, unquote, in his readout from the bilateral summit with President Biden. But also it's possible to look at guardrails in the South China Sea, the East China Sea. For example, the continued nuclear proliferation problem on the Korean Peninsula, or even beyond that in cyber and space, where there is much instability. Practically speaking, in Taiwan, and I simply use this as an example, on the American side, it would be good if their language, for example, was much more disciplined on the question of the one China policy. I, for one, have from the very beginning opposed the visit by Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan because I thought it was destabilizing and frankly reckless.
We understand there are political changes in both countries. For the U.S. midterm election results so far already shown that the Republicans are going to get hold of the House of Representatives. As a result of that, the majority leader of the House might also want to follow the steps of earlier Democrat counterparts in manipulating the Taiwan issue. So, Mr. Prime Minister, do you see the two sides, China and the U.S., are sufficient to establish these guardrails at a time when a lot of vulnerabilities actually could happen at any moment?
Well, I always regard the Taiwan issue as sufficiently complex in itself without throwing, shall I say, petrol on the fire. So you've just asked the question about the possibility of incoming Speaker McCarthy, if in fact he does become the Speaker of the House, because there are divisions in the Republican Party, and the final numbers have yet to be calculated for the House of Representatives. But he has indicated that he may go and seek to follow in the footpaths of Speaker Pelosi. I think this would be deeply unwise, and it's for the same reason that I said that Speaker Pelosi's visit was deeply unwise. Because if you ask yourself this question, does it actually advantage the people of Taiwan? I'm not sure that it does at all. But on the broader question of strategic guardrails, we have an interest in China pulling back in terms of its own military response to the Taiwan question, and for the United States to return to what I would describe as a more normal interpretation of the one China policy. That way, we return to a greater level of stability across the Taiwan Straits.
On the issue of trade and economic ties, inflation, of course, is one thing, but our trade, especially the decoupling quote-unquote phenomenon going on right now. It's very worrisome for many business people I've been talking to here in Southeast Asia on the sidelines of APEC CEO Summit. Mr. Prime Minister, tell me more about how do you see the business community and the general public will be able to contribute their input and their thoughts to the decision-making process of politicians? It seems that geopolitics are dragging us to directions that we don't want to.
Well, politics, both in China and in the United States, ultimately shapes everything else, whether we like it or not. And geopolitics tends to shape economics as well. So the critical question of all this is how to stabilize geopolitics. And that's why I think we have had a positive step forward, albeit a small one, with the Bali summit between President Xi Jinping and President Biden. And that's why, for example, you've seen stock markets around the world react with some level of positive response because they understand the value of strategic stability. In terms of economic decoupling, I've noted what both the leaders have said about their opposition to economic decoupling. Of course, both countries are seeking to attend to their own national security needs in reliable supply chains. I read very carefully what Xi Jinping said in his work report to the 20th Party Congress. And in that work report, he spoke of the need of China to have supply chains which were resilient and robust in national security as well. And that is the attitude now by a number of other countries, not just on the question of medical supplies coming out of the COVID experience, where many countries found themselves without sufficient surgical masks, without sufficient medications, without sufficient equipment to deal adequately with that crisis. And that has engendered a broader debate in many countries about, let's call it, national economic self-sufficiency. And as you know, in China, the Zili Gengsheng debate is also very strong. And so finding the right balance between what I would describe as legitimate Zili Gengsheng, legitimate national self-sufficiency for one's own national security needs on the one hand, without then decoupling the global economy, that is where the important balance lies for political leaders to achieve. And that can only be achieved if we've got an improved geopolitical environment.
I remember very clearly in one of the event descriptions put out by the Asia Society, which you are heading, it described the world in such an interesting way. And here I quote, it is transitioning from just-in-time connectedness to just-in-case resilience. Now, there is a level of emotions one could tell from the description of this. So it seems that now many business communities worried about, at least the people that I talk to, are the sanctions and also the punishments coming from the U.S. side imposed on the Chinese side. And therefore, global businesses do not know how much they have to make an effort in order to diversify. And what does that mean money-wise? And is it affordable at all? So they are really asking, who is doing the calculation of numbers and who can tell us whether it's feasible at all, Mr. Prime Minister?
Well, it's far better that trade relations are not interrupted. And it's far better that we have open trade. And in terms of trade sanctions, various countries have applied them. As you know, the United States administration, particularly in its statement of the 7th of October on semiconductors, has imposed export sanctions or bans against the People's Republic of China. As I said, what are these things the product of? They're the product of geopolitics and politics. And so we need to be very clear in our analysis about cause and effect. If we can deal with what I describe as the underlying cause here, which is accumulated political and geopolitical distrust, then, let me tell you, the economic arrangements begin to normalize. But unless we deal with the core of this question, which is the level of distrust, then we're going to see a continued polarization of individual countries, let's call it economic, trade and investment arrangements to maximize their self-sufficiency. Now, there's a danger for all of us with this, which is trade has been the great generator of global growth for the last 40 years. And if we start to retard trade across the board, then global growth will slow. It'll damage China, it'll damage the United States, it'll damage all countries. And so we need to be very careful about, as I said, getting the balance right between legitimate self-sufficiency in essential matters while trying to rebuild new levels of, or old levels of political trust and geopolitical trust, which have frankly been shredded over the last 3 to 5 years.
Mr. Prime Minister, therefore the legitimate question one would ask, particularly with the ongoing G20 Summit and the APEC economic leaders meeting, is what makes the world go around? What is the logic that you see that prevailing today? Is it about the money makes the world go around, or is it about geopolitics make the world go around, or is it about voices of the public that makes the world go around? What is the logic here?
Well, as you know, we have just been through a generation of globalization. And the generation of globalization, which really, I suppose, began at the end of the Cold War, and then endured for the subsequent 30 years or so, was a period where underlying geopolitical tensions were put to one side, whether it was between the United States and the Russian Federation, or whether it was between the United States and the People's Republic of China. By and large, from about 1992 onwards, there was an agreement that we should develop the global economy. Fundamental geopolitical suspicions were put to one side, and we decided instead to raise everybody's living standards. And you saw how that benefited the people of China, benefited people right around the world, in fact. I think in the last decade or so, we've started to see the re-emergence of strategic distrust. Of course, when you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this, of course, has been a huge impact around the world and rekindled a lot of ancient strategic distrust. And of course, there have been earlier actions in the international community. And I can simply point, for example, to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, which contributed to distrust as well. But the bottom line is our political task is to deal with this underlying problem of distrust, because it's this strategic distrust which has frankly undermined the normal processes of economic globalization. Those processes of globalization, which in my own lifetime I've observed Beijing from being a city where everyone rode a bicycle, where everyone was either in a blue uniform or a green uniform, and where I was the only one driving a car in the mid-'80s, a beaten-up Toyota, up the main, Jungleman Wai, and then across Tiananmen,
where the
and then
diplomatic
Fuxingmen
compound
Wai,
is.
and not to see another car in sight. From that Beijing to the one that you have today, and from a Shanghai which I lived in and saw not a single tall building, nothing built taller than any of the old buildings on the Waitan, the Bund, to Shanghai where it is today. The transformation has been huge, but we've now reached this political juncture where political and geopolitical distrust has returned. And unless we can deal with that at its core level, then it's very hard to wave a magic wand and say that we should return to unimpeded economic globalization. As I said, it's a question of cause and effect.
In that retrospect, Mr. Prime Minister, what are we seeing right now between China and the United States, the latest bilateral meeting? Is it going to be a temporary moment of all of us on the surface of the water just to take a breath and then once again go down to the troubled water? Or is it going to be the start of something that could, in a way, instrumentally build strategic trust, even small steps from time to time?
Well, I've always been a fan of Deng Xiaoping's axiom of 莫之失头过河, which is cross the stream by feeling the stones one by one with your feet. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in this. But of course, if you're crossing a river, you also need to have a common sense of the destination, which is that's the other side. And you're also walking with somebody else as you 莫之失头过河. So I think we should bear that aphorism in mind when we look at rebuilding strategic trust between the United States and China, or at least stabilizing the level of mistrust which currently exists. You spoke before about the short or the medium term, getting a gulp of air before sinking again. Let me try some further Luko and Susiang for you, which is, if you're going to secure the future, it's very important that you navigate the present, because if you don't navigate the present, there will be no future. And so navigating the present is very important, particularly when for the last several years, the US-China relationship has been going down the plug hole. And so therefore, it's important that we navigate the present. We find small stones which we feel across the river, and there is a way in which we can then seek to reach the other side. And again, remember what Deng Xiaoping used to say on big questions, which was, you never know, in the future, there'll be a much brighter generation who'll be able to solve some of the fundamental problems that we haven't been able to solve now.
Are you kicking the can down the road, or are we kicking the can down the road?
I'm fully in favor of kicking the can down the road, because if the alternative to kicking the can down the road is dazhang, I am the world's best can kicker, because I do not like war. I don't think anybody likes war. And I think we've got a generation of people who have no living memory of what a war was like. And it seems just like a word, W-A-R, or 战争 in Chinese. And for a generation of people, and perhaps two generations of people, it doesn't evoke the reality of what, for example, the Chinese people suffered during the Second World War through the Japanese occupation, or what my own father, who was a serviceman during the war, suffered in terms of the Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia and the attack on Australia. So, we shouldn't fool around with war. Therefore, the question is, how do we build a peace? How do we secure what I've called as being what I call the avoidable war, in order to make sure that for our kids and our grandkids, like us, they can enjoy peace and prosperity. But that means the hard business of rebuilding strategic trust, or at least rebuilding strategic trust and stabilizing what is currently a very deep level of strategic distrust. And where that practical work begins is when Secretary of State Blinken goes to Beijing early next year to sit down with Wang Yi and the rest of the Chinese team to work out which of those stones are we going to now work on to cross the river.
China-Australian leadership met first time since many years already. So what is your assessment of the nature of that meeting? What does that mean for bilateral relations? It seems that both sides are quite reminiscent of the good relationship earlier.
Well, I think it's right. I mean, the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations occurs on, from memory, the 2nd or the 3rd of December, which is only next month. And so we've travelled a long way since then. And most of it has been a very good journey. Of course, some problems have arisen in recent times. But I think what I would say is that the new Australian government, in its approach to the China relationship, has made it quite plain that they want to stabilise our bilateral relationship. And when I look carefully at the readout from President Xi Jinping and his meeting with Prime Minister Albanese only yesterday, I think President Xi is sending much the same signal. And therefore, I think we should take this as the first step towards restabilising that relationship. And I would certainly like to see things return to a much more normal state of relations in the future. But once again, one step at a time. But at least in Bali, we've taken the first step, and that is a good thing.
Mr. Prime Minister, as always, thank you so much. Kevin Rudd, President and CEO of Asia Society. Thank you, sir. This November has seen Asia take center stage in global governance. As the G20 wrapped up Wednesday in Bali, Indonesia, the 29th APEC Economic Leaders Meeting kicks off. My team and I are already here in Thailand on the scene for the APEC 2022. We will be bringing to you special programs, including high-level panels I host at the APEC CEO Summit and interviews with movers and shakers on the sidelines of the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting. The Asia-Pacific is on her way back after years of the pandemic amid much uncertainties. Open, connect, and balance. Those are the aspirations, but solemn answers are needed about how. Join me on site at the APEC 2022 in Thailand, the last stop of a series of crucial multilateral engagements this year. We are here to wrap it up with direct analysis and frank interviews, only on World Insight.